She paid for first class, dressed neat, walked tall, and still, within minutes of stepping on board, they told her she didn't belong. A flight attendant pointed to the back without checking the ticket. A man in a suit took her seat like it was always meant for him. The laughter was quiet, but the message was loud. This wasn't about seats. This was about skin. One flight, one girl, one storm that started with humiliation and ended with something no one on that plane saw coming. She never shouted. She never broke. But by the time the wheels hit the runway, power had shifted, and justice didn't need an announcement. It had already boarded. This is not just a story about travel. This is a story about the altitude of arrogance and how far it can fall. So before we dive in, tell us, what would you have done if it was you? Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like this need to be seen, hit that like, subscribe, and stay tuned. This is only the beginning. The terminal was awash of announcements and polished shoes echoing down long marble corridors. Gate A11 gleamed under artificial lights, its boarding lane divided by velvet ropes that funneled passengers into economy and first class. At the front of the shorter line stood Arlena Whitmore, 17, quiet, composed, dressed in clean denim and a navy hoodie with a faded university crest. Her boarding pass trembled slightly in her grip, not from fear, but anticipation. It wasn't every day she flew alone, let alone in first class, let alone for something this big. Her father had called it a gift, said she'd earned it. She believed him, until she stepped onto the plane. The carpet in the first-class cabin was thick, dark blue, untouched by dirt. Leather seats shimmered under soft overhead lighting. Cold air conditioned down from ceiling vents like it belonged to another altitude. Arlena walked slowly, scanning seat numbers. She found it, 1C, aisle, and turned to stow her bag overhead. But before her hand even reached the latch, a voice sliced through the murmur of boarding. It was sharp and clipped, with the kind of cadence that brooked no reply. The flight attendant, a tall woman in her early 40s with platinum hair pulled back so tightly it strained her temples, stood with her arms folded and her chin slightly raised. Her name tag read K. Delaney. She looked directly at Arlena as though assessing a misplaced item. The expression wasn't one of confusion. It was familiarity laced with contempt. Before Arlena could speak, Delaney stepped forward, pointed a manicured finger, and said that seat wasn't hers. No explanation, no apology, just assertion. Arlena blinked, then quietly handed over her boarding pass. Delaney barely looked at it before returning her gaze to Arlena, who still stood beside the seat she'd paid for. Behind them, a man in a navy suit and expensive cologne appeared in the aisle. His silver hair was slicked back, and the way he looked at the row was as if he were already used to claiming it. Delaney turned toward him, and her entire demeanor softened, voice warmer, posture more inviting. She motioned toward the seat Arlena had yet to touch. The man nodded curtly, as if this were the natural order of things. He hadn't asked for the seat. He hadn't checked his number, but he walked past Arlena and slid into 1C without pause. Arlena remained standing. Delaney turned back to her and asked if she could step aside while they sorted the manifest. Arlena's mouth opened, but nothing came. Something inside her told her the moment she spoke, the situation would only escalate. Delaney turned without waiting for a response and walked briskly up the aisle. Arlena stood awkwardly, clutching her duffel, watching the man recline and scroll through his phone as if she no longer existed. Minutes passed. No one offered help. No one asked questions. A man in the window seat beside 1C glanced over, registered her with a raised brow, then returned to tapping on his tablet. Finally, Delaney returned and informed Arlena the seat had been reassigned. System error. She would be relocated. When Arlena asked where, the answer came without hesitation. Rear cabin, row 29, middle seat. No apologies. No compensation. No acknowledgement of the disparity. Arlena stood her ground, quiet. Her eyes flicked again to the boarding pass still in Delaney's hand. Still clearly marked 1C. Still valid. Still hers. She could feel eyes now, passengers watching from behind their newspapers, above their laptops. But no one moved. No one spoke. Delaney took a step forward, lowered her voice, and said she needed Arlena to comply or she'd be forced to delay takeoff. It was said softly, but not without threat. Arlena nodded once and turned, walking the full length of the plane with the weight of every stair pressing between her shoulder blades. Her sneakers made no sound on the carpet, but each step felt louder than the last. Guess it's student travel day, huh? Maybe they let her on for good behavior. Across the aisle, someone chuckled under their breath. Arlena didn't react, her eyes fixed on the laminated safety card in front of her, but the lines of text blurred beneath the slow burn forming in her chest. She had learned long ago how to sit still when the air around her tried to push her out. The flight was still boarding, though slowly now, as if time had entered molasses. A baby 2 rows back cried once, then was shushed. A suitcase thudded into an overhead bin. Arlena folded her arms tighter. She didn't want to breathe too deeply for fear that any movement might give them more reason to question why she was there. Then came the sound of heels, deliberate, quick, punctuated. The same flight attendant from earlier, Delaney, appeared at the front of the cabin again, clipboard in hand, lips tight in a professional line. Her voice rose just enough to slice through the low murmur of the cabin, drawing attention not with volume but with tone. Attention passengers, we're conducting a quick seating verification. Please remain seated while we confirm final adjustments. Her eyes flicked down the list and then up again, scanning the cabin like a hawk seeking movement. She began reading aloud row numbers and corresponding seat codes, and for several rows, passengers nodded, satisfied, unfazed. But when she reached row 29, her tone shifted. There appeared to be a discrepancy in seating for 29B. Please raise your hand if you are occupying that seat. Arlena, heart stuttering, lifted her hand slowly. Delaney approached with quiet urgency, clipboard against her hip like a badge. And your name, miss? Her voice was cool, devoid of warmth, structured to sound official. Arlena gave her name. Delaney clicked her pen without looking up. Thank you. For internal audit purposes, please remain seated while this is reviewed. She turned, but not before adding with quiet sharpness, we appreciate everyone's cooperation, especially those in temporary accommodations. The man beside Arlena smirked, leaned slightly her way. You're probably not even supposed to be here. Huh? Bet someone at the gate just wanted to avoid a scene. He chuckled again, as if this were camaraderie. The woman on Arlena's right shuffled uncomfortably and turned her head away. No one intervened. A few rows ahead, a passenger in a tan blazer lowered his phone, stared for a second too long, then tapped at his screen as if recording notes. Arlena noticed, but didn't move. It felt like her very presence had become a disruption. A moment later, Delaney reemerged. Her voice, now more rehearsed than ever, rang through the cabin with performative concern. To ensure all guests receive appropriate service levels, we are reminding those temporarily moved due to manifest conflicts to be mindful of policy compliance. Her eyes landed briefly on Arlena as she said it. The implication hung heavier than her words. Somewhere near the galley, laughter erupted, muted and then suppressed, like a joke had landed well among the crew. Arlena sat frozen, her nails dug into her palms where they rested beneath her crossed arms. Her boarding pass was crumpled in her hoodie pocket now, useless as armor. She considered, for a flicker of a moment, standing up and walking to the front, demanding to be heard. But the moment passed. The cost of raising her voice, of becoming visible again, felt higher than she could afford. A ripple of tension vibrated through her spine and out through her limbs. This wasn't just a reassignment. This was performance, a script rehearsed to delegitimize her without saying anything explicitly cruel. She had seen it before in boardrooms, in classrooms, in quiet rejections labeled as misunderstandings. Around her, the temperature of the cabin felt colder, or maybe that was just the silence thickening like fog. No one looked at her directly anymore, but the awareness of her presence spread like static across cloth and skin. Every moment of that first hour in the air became a study in restraint. Arlena didn't speak. She didn't request water. She didn't ask for a blanket or adjust the air vent. She folded into stillness, hoping to disappear into the vinyl of her seat. Her thoughts drifted to her father, who had insisted on this trip, on this airline, on this cabin. He'd been so proud. You deserve to sit where they said you could. Don't let anyone shift your gravity. He hadn't known gravity here didn't just pull down. It crushed. When the drink cart finally reached row 29, the attendant paused, offered options to the man beside Arlena, then the woman to her right. After Delaney's thinly veiled announcement and the silent omissions from the previous service pass, the rest of the passengers seemed to settle into a collective state of passive detachment. Yet within that silence, Arlena felt more watched than ever. It wasn't the kind of watching that demanded confrontation. It was the kind that denied your existence while constantly assessing your presence. The man beside her, the same one who had joked earlier, shifted, crossed his arms, and leaned slightly away from her. He didn't say anything this time. He didn't have to. The distance said enough. The woman on Arlena's other side began collecting her things 10 minutes after the drink service passed. Without glancing at Arlena, she pressed the call button and whispered something to the attendant who arrived. A quiet nod followed. Moments later, she stood, stepped into the aisle, and relocated herself to an open seat across the row, near the emergency exit. Arlena glanced at her briefly, but received no acknowledgement. Not even a brief glance of discomfort. The message was clear. Even proximity to her was undesirable. That silent migration rippled through the cabin, like an unspoken endorsement of exclusion. Arlena sat between empty seats now, flanked by ghosts and judgment. She stared ahead. If she looked too long at any passenger, they averted their gaze. If she turned slightly, someone would reach for headphones or pretend to sleep. The social choreography was immaculate. She wasn't being harassed. She was being erased. The captain made an announcement about weather patterns over the Great Lakes. A slight turbulence warning. Fasten seatbelts. No one flinched. No one reacted, except for one man 2 rows behind her, sitting by the window, partially shielded by the wing of the plane. He was in his late 60s, wiry, dressed in slacks and a faded blazer that hadn't seen dry cleaning in years, but hung with a kind of old-world dignity. His white hair was combed neatly, his posture straight. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't reached for headphones, hadn't opened a laptop. Instead, he held a slim, black notebook, the kind bound in leather and filled with lined pages. In his left hand, a fountain pen tapped lightly on the cover. Occasionally, he scribbled something. His eyes had drifted to Arlena more than once, not in the curious, impolite way of others, but in brief, measured assessments. She noticed it only because it was so different from the rest. He never stared. He observed. When Delaney passed again with the second round of drinks, the man watched her carefully. His pen moved across the paper in small, deliberate gestures. Not fast, not dramatic, as if recording facts, not impressions. A few moments later, when a second attendant came through to distribute hot towels, offering them only to the forward rows and completely bypassing row 29, he again wrote something down. Arlena didn't know who he was. She only sensed that he didn't belong in the same script. She returned her eyes forward, focused on the tray table in front of her, pretending to read the magazine in the seat pocket, though the words made no impression. Her stomach churned slightly. Not from fear, not even from humiliation anymore. From something deeper. A slow realization that she had entered space where even basic fairness had been suspended. When the turbulence began, it was subtle at first. A dip of vibration, then a sharper jolt. The plane steadied again, but in those few moments, heads lifted. People reached for seatbelts, murmured to each other. Arlena didn't move. She had never unbuckled hers. She was still locked in, not just by the strap around her hips, but by the need to remain invisible. A voice came over the intercom again, reassuring. "Cabin crew, please take your jump seats." The attendant near the galley, the one who had taken the whispered request earlier, returned with a cart full of meal trays. Her eyes swept past Arlena as if she were part of the seat structure. Trays were distributed to the rows ahead and behind, but none reached row 29. Not one. The man in 29 a glance sideways. Not at Arlena. At her tray. Empty. Then he shrugged and continued eating. A flight is an odd place to observe cruelty. It doesn't arrive with yelling or pushing or overt rejection. It arrives in small, calculated gaps. In where towels stop being handed out. In where food skips. In the ways eyes slide past you like fog over water. Arlena's hunger returned, but she quelled it. There had been no confrontation, just suggestion backed by pressure, just enough implication in her phrasing to make refusal feel dangerous. "We've had a rearrangement for weight distribution," she had said, though the flight wasn't full. The older man with the notebook had raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. No one else reacted. And so Arlena moved. Again. Her new seat was tight against a bulkhead that didn't recline, boxed between the aisle and a metal wall, dividing the crew's workspace. As she sat down, the airflow felt thinner here, the noise of mechanical humming louder, and the glances rarer. She was now outside the domain of concern. She reached into her bag, pulled out the paperback she had dropped earlier, smoothed the cover, and flipped to a page she didn't remember. Her eyes scanned the words, but her mind lingered somewhere else, suspended above the cabin like condensation above clouds. Then came the voice, lower, male, younger. A different uniform. A male attendant with slick back hair, square shoulders, and the kind of forced smile that ended before it reached his eyes. He stood beside her and asked, politely but firmly, to check her bag. No immediate reason. No incident. Just a routine verification. Company policy. Arlena froze, caught between compliance and shame. Her fingers tightened slightly around the book in her hand. She asked why, calmly, but the attendant's response was practiced, too smooth. "We've had a discrepancy in baggage tags. Just to be sure everything's in order." It wasn't true. Her carry-on was beneath her seat, tagged, zipped, untouched since boarding. But questioning him now would mean escalating. And escalation, in this space, always had a cost. Without a word, she unzipped her bag and tilted it toward him. He reached in not with hesitation, but with purpose, shuffling items quickly, flipping the corners of books, tugging slightly at a cloth pouch with toiletries. He found nothing. He expected nothing. But the performance was for someone else. When he was finished, he gave a short nod and left. Arlena zipped her bag again slowly, her fingers steady but cold. Just across the aisle, a young woman had been watching. She looked no older than 25, with pale hair cut into a neat bob and a calm stillness to her face that didn't match the tension of the moment. Her hands rested atop a padded tablet case. Her eyes never left Arlena during the search, but she didn't speak. When the attendant left, she turned slightly toward the man next to her, a tall figure with a narrow jaw and expressive eyes. They didn't speak aloud. Instead, the woman lifted her hands and began to sign. Her movements were precise, clear, fluid in rhythm. The man responded instantly, nodding once, his eyes scanning the aisle where the attendant had disappeared. He signed back, quickly, intensely, and she responded again, slower this time, almost careful. They weren't ordinary passengers. They were communicating not just what had happened, but how. Lip reading, gesture detail, posture analysis. Without a single piece of video equipment, they had recorded everything. Arlena didn't notice them at first. She had returned to her seat, her head low, eyes on the page. But the words blurred again. She could feel the warmth of humiliation bloom behind her ears, her face heating as if the shame had been injected straight into her bloodstream. This wasn't about her belongings. It wasn't about safety. It was about reminding her she could be touched, interrupted, scrutinized, and that no one would stop it. The attendant didn't return, but the message had been delivered. Across the aisle, the young woman opened a narrow leather notebook from her bag and began writing. She was left-handed. Her strokes were even. The man beside her kept watching the aisle, occasionally glancing at the cockpit, then back to the rows behind them. They weren't part of the crew, but something about the intensity of their presence suggested a different kind of mission. Observation. Interpretation. Arlena noticed them only when she glanced sideways while turning a page. Their gaze didn't shift toward her. They didn't make it obvious. But she caught the angle of the woman's hand as she wrote a specific sentence. Passenger 29F, secondary search, no warrant, no protocol. The line was underlined twice. Arlena blinked and looked away. The air vent above her hummed louder now. She turned it slightly, then gave up. It didn't help. She reached again for the water bottle in her side pouch, only to realize she had never been given one. All around her, passengers slept, watched movies, or stared quietly into space. They were flying above the clouds now, but Arlena felt no lightness, no freedom, only the weight of displacement, layered with the ache of knowing she was being tested, not for safety, not for procedure, but for endurance. Another hour passed before a different crew member walked past and offered a tray of fruit to the row behind her. She had not spoken in over an hour. Her last act of engagement with the flight crew had ended in a silent search of her belongings and a rehearsed thank you that never reached her ears. The turbulence had passed, but in its wake came something more insidious. The ease with which others now regarded her presence as a disruption to be explained away or ignored. The lights dimmed again as cabin service entered its final phase. Passengers began murmuring softly, reshuffling trays, finishing beverages. Arlena didn't touch anything. She hadn't been given anything. Her mouth was dry and her hands folded in her lap like stone. She stared at the safety card again, not reading but anchoring. Then the voice came, not a whisper, not private, but projected clearly down the aisle by a female flight attendant with a practiced cadence that mimicked hospitality but masked something colder. Her words came between cabin updates and menu options, slipped in like a disclaimer. We remind all passengers that seating arrangements are made according to tier status and verified reservation records. Upgrades and reassignments are not a courtesy extended to last-minute bookings or to guests who do not meet executive loyalty criteria. The words were not directed at anyone by name, but they hovered like a drone, slowly descending until they wrapped around row 30, where Arlena sat motionless. A few heads tilted subtly, some toward her, some away. The message was received. Her body went stiller, if such a thing was possible. Her breath was measured, the way someone might breathe in a courtroom before hearing a verdict. She said nothing. She moved nothing. But the burn of public exposure coated her skin like acid. 2 rows ahead, a child's voice rose suddenly, sharp in its clarity. "Mommy, why does that girl sit back here if she's supposed to be special?" The child's voice was innocent, the kind that still assumed fairness governed all decisions. The mother, seated straight and composed, bent her head low, cupped a hand behind her daughter's ear, and whispered something so brief and soft that only the girl heard it. Whatever was said transformed the child's expression. The curiosity drained from her eyes and was replaced with something heavier, colder, a look far too old for her age. She turned in her seat just enough to glance back at Arlena, not with fascination, not even confusion, but with judgment, quiet and complete. Arlena felt the stare but didn't return it. She had already learned what those looks meant. They were not anger. They were not hatred. They were the practiced apathy of those who had been taught what categories deserved space and which ones should be questioned. In this moment, Arlena wasn't a person. She was a deviation, an exception that needed explaining. And the system, the one that thrived on order-image hierarchy, was built to correct deviations. Up front, someone laughed. The flight attendant had made another passing remark about loyalty members having certain expectations of their flying experience. No names were said, no accusations made, but the effect was surgical, like carving out dignity without drawing blood. Behind her, the man with the notebook remained in his seat, still writing. Occasionally, his eyes drifted to the galley. Occasionally, they landed on Arlena. He said nothing. The couple across the aisle, the ones who had signed earlier, now sat silently, their hands still and unreadable. The woman looked over once, eyes steady, as if calculating the limits of their silence. But she said nothing. No one said anything. The plane seemed to agree on its collective role. Remain silent, let the order hold, let the anomaly fade. Arlena could feel the gravity of that silence pressing her down, heavier than the cabin pressure. She adjusted her posture slightly, not from discomfort, but to stay grounded. If she shifted too much, someone might see her as agitated. If she looked up, someone might see defiance. She could not afford either. From a corner of her vision, she noticed the child turning back toward the window. Her mother opened a magazine, flipping past glossy photos of beaches and watches. The atmosphere around them returned to stillness, but something had changed. A man in the row ahead of Arlena asked for a ginger ale and was handed one without delay. A woman beside him received an extra blanket. On the opposite side of the aisle, a group of 4 laughed over the remains of a wine flight tasting tray, their glasses refilled without request. Arlena sat motionless, parched and exhausted, the inside of her mouth dry from the hours of unbroken silence. She waited for the cart to approach and made eye contact with the younger of the 2 male attendants. He wore the same crisp uniform, his hair neatly trimmed, his badge gleaming. As he reached her row, she spoke softly, a question formed with all the caution of someone asking permission to exist. "Excuse me, may I have a glass of water?" The attendant's face remained neutral, but his hand froze briefly on the cart. He didn't look directly at her. Instead, he shifted his gaze to the clipboard clipped near the juice dispenser's skimmed column, and then turned back to her without a smile. "I'm sorry, but complimentary beverages in this section are restricted to priority tier passengers and authorized bookings." She blinked, absorbing the words. Her boarding pass had said first class. Her seat had been reassigned. Her presence had been pushed, doubted, inspected, demoted. Now, she had lost the right to hydration. The cart rolled on without pause. She did not ask again. She didn't move. The man across the aisle raised his eyebrows but said nothing. The woman 3 seats back cleared her throat, then looked away. The silence pressed in like humidity before a storm. But not every ear in that cabin relied on words alone. 3 rows forward, seated beside the aisle in an inconspicuous seat, was a woman who had said nothing since boarding. Her eyes were hidden behind dark glasses, her movements slow, deliberate. A thin white cane rested against her leg, secured beneath her folded arm. Her head had turned slightly when the attendant gave his response. It turned again as he rolled away. She did not rely on sight to assess what she heard. She had learned to interpret the world through vibrations, tone, the shift of air against fabric, the way voices strained or compressed when lying or pretending. Her fingers, hidden beneath a soft shawl, curled slightly around a small black disc pinned to her lapel, a modified sound mapping device capable of recording tonal shifts and stress frequencies in voices. It had been gifted to her by a former colleague at the university, part of a pilot project to track audio patterns in public service environments for accessibility research. She had asked for permission to test it discreetly during flights. The airline had agreed. It was running now. She had begun recording when she felt the difference in vocal frequency during boarding, the artificial lift in tone when greeting passengers of one appearance, the drop and flatten when addressing others. When Arlena had been relocated the first time, the shift in cadence had been marked. During the bag search, the male attendant's breathing pattern had spiked briefly before resuming a calm monotone. When Delaney had made her announcement about seating hierarchy, the tension had been so tangible it had resonated like static against the seat frames. The denial of water, however, was different. The attendant's voice didn't rise. It didn't lower. It narrowed. A cold, clinical delivery wrapped in policy. The data would show a tightening of the throat muscles, a brief pause before speaking, the choice of restricted words, restricted, authorized, section. The woman adjusted the small device slightly and angled her head toward the rear galley. She didn't need to see what was happening to understand its meaning. She had heard this pattern before, in courtroom audio, in emergency call transcripts, in interviews where compassion had been replaced by rehearsed protocol. She didn't know Arlena's name. She didn't know what had preceded this moment. But the story was being written in sound, and she was listening. Arlena, meanwhile, sat with her knees drawn inward, her hands folded together so tightly the skin along her knuckles had paled. She no longer looked toward the attendants. Her gaze was downward, not in submission, but in withdrawal. She had moved beyond the expectation of fairness. She had begun preparing for impact. Her body felt sore from stillness, her shoulders heavy. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't make her the problem. Her water request denied, her belongings searched, her seating rearranged not once, but twice, her presence ignored with a meticulousness that bordered on cruelty. Yet she had done nothing more than breathe, sit, and comply. She had not raised her voice. She had not broken a rule. But she had become a spectacle nonetheless, one made more piercing by its quietness. The aircraft rumbled softly as it adjusted altitude for final descent. Arlena's posture was straight now, but no longer from tension. There was an air of calculation in her stillness, the way a chess player waits while watching the last pieces shift into place. She reached slowly into the pocket of her hoodie, pulled out a phone wrapped in a simple mat case, and unlocked it without hesitation. The glow from the screen reflected in her eyes, steady and unreadable. She scrolled past a list of messages and paused on a contact marked by a single character. A. Her thumb tapped it once. The device rang for 2 seconds. Then silence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The signal was embedded in the call itself. She returned the phone to her lap, screen down, and looked out the window without moving her head. Outside, the landscape below grew larger. Trees sharpened. Roads widened. Then came the sound, small at first, like a cough in the distance. Then louder. Not panic-inducing, not alarming, but definitive. The engine tone shifted. A stutter in the rhythm. A soft whine faded into an unnatural hush. The cabin lights blinked once. The attendants stopped mid-stride. One of them, carrying a clipboard near the cockpit, paused, pressed a finger to his earpiece, and changed direction. Another murmured something to the galley crew. Overhead, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The captain has received an unexpected operations notice. We are initiating a temporary holding pattern. Thank you for your cooperation." The engine roar lowered another octave, as if the aircraft had sighed. The cabin stilled. A ripple passed through passengers as they adjusted their posture, looked around, but said nothing too loudly. The couple in the business row exchanged a glance. The man with the notebook flipped to a clean page. The woman with the audio device tilted her head ever so slightly and reached into her bag without hesitation. The crew began circulating quietly, checking seatbelts, their smiles thinner, their confidence shaken by something beyond turbulence. In the cockpit, a series of rapid confirmations flickered through the control panel. A priority override had been received, not from air traffic control, but from the internal communications channel reserved only for the board-level operations authority of the airline. This wasn't routine. This was structural. The first officer looked at the captain, confused. He gestured silently to a flashing alert. The words read, "Execute hold. Do not descend. Stand by for repositioning." Underneath, a secure line blinked red. The captain pressed it. The voice that answered was not one they expected. It was crisp, controlled, and carried the quiet weight of someone used to being obeyed. Flight 117 is now under advisory pause by order of the Strategic Oversight Executive Board. Do not continue descent. Await instructions. Internal investigation in process. When the message ended, neither pilot spoke. They simply turned dials, recalibrated settings, and followed orders. In row 30, Arlena didn't blink. She sat as she had for hours, motionless and quiet, but now something had shifted beneath her expression. Not anger, not pride, just certainty. The woman beside the emergency door, a nervous flyer who had spent most of the journey murmuring prayers under her breath, looked up as the cabin crew walked past again. This time, their pace was brisker, more focused. One of them approached Delaney near the galley and whispered something quickly, barely masking the urgency. Delaney's face paled slightly. She reached for her own comms pin and tapped it twice. Then she disappeared into the forward cabin. The passengers began to murmur. A delay? Mechanical failure? Weather? No announcement clarified. But the shift was unmistakable. Something had intervened from outside the aircraft, from above the captain, above the airline's internal systems. Something or someone had inserted a single line of code into the flight's timeline and changed its entire trajectory. Delaney had not returned from the front. The cockpit door had remained sealed for longer than protocol allowed. Arlena sat still in her seat, her hands folded, her phone silent, the last message displayed on its darkened screen now etched in her mind. Passengers whispered. Some exchanged theories. Others grew impatient. But before speculation could congeal into unrest, the intercom chimed again, not with the captain's voice this time, but with one smoother, deeper, colder. Ladies and gentlemen, this aircraft is temporarily under administrative review. We ask that you remain seated. A special operations liaison will board shortly to conduct direct inquiries under authority of the Strategic Oversight Board. Your cooperation is appreciated. The voice ended with no identifying name, no soft chuckle, no hospitality, just command. Moments later, the front door of the aircraft reopened. This, too, was irregular. Once sealed, a door midair should never reopen. But protocol had been overridden. A man stepped in. He wore no uniform, no tie. A charcoal gray suit, subtle, expensive, fit to precision. No badge, but everyone understood his presence was not optional. He held a folder in one hand and nothing in the other. His walk was unhurried. His gaze scanned rows like a mathematician checking formulas. When he reached the center of the cabin, he paused, flipped open a folder, and spoke clearly. I am Nicholas Hale, representing Legal and Operations Authority on behalf of the Executive Board. At this time, I am here to address a procedural violation that has resulted in the unlawful treatment of a passenger under protected designation. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. Yet his words landed like hammers, reshaping the cabin in seconds. Some passengers stiffened. Others turned fully in their seats. Some instinctively looked toward the back, where Arlena sat, still, silent, unchanged. Hale turned to her row, stepped forward, and continued. Passenger 30F, Miss Arlena Whitmore, is under executive protection status as a named beneficiary of Bennett Group Holdings. Her presence aboard this aircraft was arranged through direct authorization from ownership and internal charter compliance. All personnel who engaged in unauthorized searches, reassignments, or denials of service will now be subject to real-time compliance review. He turned. Behind him, 2 additional individuals had stepped on board. One carried a hard case and a narrow console. The other held a tablet displaying an active feed. They did not address the passengers. They moved toward the galley and began plugging into a port beneath the service panel. From overhead compartments and internal cabin microphones, the hidden architecture of the aircraft began to wake. Skylink AI, the internal system installed across first-class and executive-tier cabins for service optimization, had long been trained not just to process requests, but to interpret emotional frequencies, tone of voice, vocal tension, verbal aggression markers. It had been advertised to passengers as a convenience. Suggested wine pairings, early detection of discomfort, proactive hospitality. But it had deeper layers, available only to the operational core. Hale turned to Delaney, who had now reappeared near the curtain, pale and composed but rattled. A flat voice issued from the console, commencing retrieval of incident data, parsing indexed voice markers for sections 1 through 32, compiling conflict triggers. Timeline integrity check initiated. Then, audio fragments began to echo, quieted first. Excuse me, that seat isn't yours. I'm going to need you to step aside. We have certain standards for service. That item must be checked. This isn't personal, but I have policies to follow. They weren't dramatic. They weren't screamed. But when layered together, with rising inflections and underlying condescension isolated and amplified, they painted a picture that could not be denied. The system translated these fragments into metrics. Visual charts displayed on the tablet began to map aggression levels, bias indicators, time-stamped deviations from neutral protocol. each bar of data, each red spike in vocal pressure, outlined where dignity had been eroded, not all at once, but piece by piece. Hale reviewed them with no outward reaction. Behind him, Delaney tried to speak, her voice quieter now. "Sir, I didn't know who she was. We were just—" The silence that followed that sentence was worse than judgment. Hale responded only with data. The board did. They knew. And this wasn't about who she was. It's about what you chose to be. The atmosphere shifted from passive curiosity to anxious stillness, as if the very oxygen had thickened with accountability. Arlena remained standing beside her seat, her posture unwavering, her presence now magnified not by spectacle but by silence. Around her, no one moved. The man with the notebook remained in his seat, scribbling faster now. The woman with the audio device kept her chin raised, her fingers gently resting on the edge of her cane. The two passengers who had communicated via sign earlier sat in still concentration, hands still, eyes watchful. In the galley, Delaney no longer gave instructions. She was no longer addressed as supervisor. She was now flanked by two compliance agents in discreet gray uniforms, their presence not aggressive but absolute. One held a small tablet streaming protocol logs and a list of infractions attached to her ID. The screen glowed with rows of red flags, voice deviations, service inconsistencies, escalation triggers, all timestamped, all undeniable. Without ceremony, the taller of the agents looked at Delaney and handed her a slim black envelope. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the single page inside. Her breath caught. She asked a question no one answered. Her voice faltered. She tried again, quieter. But the decision had already been made. Effective immediately, her contract was terminated under Clause 9.6 of the Human Systems Integrity Act. There would be no payout, no letter of recommendation. Her employment record would be sealed and transferred to civil arbitration. Pending investigation, she was not to approach any passenger she had interacted with during the flight. She stood still, frozen in her neatly pressed uniform, watching her entire career dissolve in the space of a few lines. The male attendant who had searched Arlena's bag was next. His name was retrieved, his behavior assessed, his excuse of following procedure reviewed against official guidelines. The AI transcript showed no direct instruction, no confirmed violation from the passenger. Only initiative rooted in assumption. He too was handed a notice. His face went pale. Another attendant, the one who had denied Arlena water, attempted to justify the restriction with policy language. But the recorded transcript showed that similar requests were granted without hesitation to adjacent passengers not on any special list. Bias in enforcement was confirmed. A fourth crew member who had remained silent but complicit was cited for failure to intervene. The final two were named in supplementary reports submitted by observing passengers, including the woman who had signed throughout the flight and the man who had tracked service discrepancies with precision. The six of them stood near the front cabin, some whispering among themselves, others refusing to look at anyone. Behind them, the remaining crew members operated on edge, their authority fractured, their professionalism cracked. The aircraft landed at an alternate airport 37 minutes later, escorted by a private tarmac unit. Passengers remained seated while compliance officers entered first. Their arrival was unannounced, their suits marked only with a small silver badge on the chest. They requested only one thing: the flight manifest. No one disembarked until the 6 crew members had been escorted off the aircraft. Not with handcuffs, not with dramatics, just quiet precision. Arlena did not look at them as they left. She had already said all she needed to by surviving the flight in silence. Near the back of the plane, a man in a green cardigan pulled a sketchbook from his carry-on. He was known in academic circles, a professor of modern social ethics who published under the pen name Callahan. He had watched every moment unfold with a calm intensity, not intervening, but processing. On page 1 of his sketchbook, he drew the first frame, a girl seated in a premium seat, her boarding pass highlighted with a faint glow, her head turned as a uniformed finger pointed her toward the back. In frame 2, she sat between strangers, her knees drawn together, her bag unzipped. In frame 3, the water was refused. In frame 4, the seatbelt never unfastened. The last frame of the sequence was not of Arlena. It was of the crew, lined up at the front of the cabin, their eyes cast downward, their uniforms no longer symbols of service, but remnants of assumption. The professor titled the sketch series Cabin Altitude, a double entendre on both the literal pressure of flight and the moral altitude expected of those who serve others. Upon landing, he uploaded the panels to his private forum, shared only with the community of educators, cultural scholars, and legal advisors. Within hours, the images were circulating among symposium networks. By morning, the sketches were projected on the walls of 2 major universities during ethics lectures. The wind that swept across the tarmac the morning after Flight 117 landed felt different to the few who remained on the ground. The sky was clear, the sun sharp against the windows of the terminal, but the air carried the residue of a flight that had never truly arrived. Inside the administrative building of Skylux Airlines, a conference room stood quiet but heavy, its walls lined with framed awards and corporate values etched in glass. One of the 6 former crew members, Michael Leary, the junior attendant who had searched Arlena's bag without cause, sat alone at a table with a stack of legal documents unopened beside him. His uniform was gone, replaced by a soft button-down shirt and eyes ringed with fatigue. He had already received the decision: indefinite suspension pending civil mediation. No badge, no reinstatement. But it wasn't the punishment that haunted him. It was the silence. Not Arlena's silence, but his own. He had seen it before, passengers treated as anomalies, small acts of control hidden behind professionalism, biases executed through policy. And each time, he had said nothing. This time he acted, not from malice, but from routine. And that was worse. Months later, he released a public letter addressed not to Arlena, but to those who watched and did nothing. He confessed to his part, not just in the search, but in every moment before it, in every silence, every glance away. He wrote, "I used to think being neutral was safe. That silence was professional, but it was cowardice. I became a mirror to injustice, and I called it order." The letter was shared among aviation ethics forums and reposted by a network of flight training academies. Invitations followed, panels, seminars. When asked if he would ever fly again, he replied, "Only as a passenger. I belong on the ground until I've earned the right to look people in the eye again." He became a guest lecturer in ethics for frontline service professionals, emphasizing how routine can become ritual, and ritual can become cruelty. Meanwhile, Delaney vanished from public view. Months passed, then a year, then a headline. Former flight attendant speaks for first time since high-profile dismissal. The announcement was for an episode of a streaming docuseries titled The Reframe, Stories of Personal Reckoning, known for humanizing individuals who had fallen from grace and committed to change. In the preview clip, Delaney sat in a dimly lit studio, her hair now loose, her voice low. She didn't deny what happened. She didn't offer excuses. She said, "I believed excellence meant control. That composure meant authority. I thought protecting the image of the brand justified any assumption I made about someone who didn't fit that image. I didn't realize I had been trained to see silence as a warning sign, not as strength." She paused. And that girl, she never raised her voice, never resisted. "But I have never felt so confronted in my life." The interviewer asked what she had learned. Delaney answered without blinking, "I learned that humility isn't the opposite of pride. It's the cure for it." The episode trended for days, not out of sympathy, but because of the rawness in her voice when she spoke of being stripped of identity, not as punishment, but as revelation. She now volunteered with an organization that trained airline staff to recognize implicit bias, not through theory, but through immersion simulations that recreated moments similar to Flight 117. She never used Arlena's name, but she carried the consequence of her presence. As for Arlena, she never appeared on any talk show, never gave interviews, never responded to public curiosity. She returned to her studies, then joined her father's foundation under a pseudonym. working in silence to restructure travel access programs for underrepresented youth. She became known not as a symbol, but as a strategist, someone who understood that justice wasn't won through applause, but through systems rebuilt from within. One photograph emerged almost a year later, a blurry image from a closed-door panel hosted at a university in D.C., where a guest speaker stood beside a whiteboard diagram labeled Passenger Perception versus Protocol Reality. The woman in the photo wore a navy blazer, her hair tied back, her posture relaxed but firm. Arlena had never needed to prove she belonged in any seat. She had only needed the space to be unbothered. The rest took care of itself. The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. What part of this journey hit you the hardest? Was it the silence, the shift in power, or the final reckoning? Let us know in the comments. And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location below. We'd love to see how far this story travels.